I'm Nick Vitchev, Research Director at Chartis. I'm very pleased to have with me three very distinguished speakers, Guy Sheppard, Raina, Verma, and Stephen Shapiro. Before we can dive into some of the questions, can I just ask each of you to do a very quick introduction? Maybe we could start with Guy, going in alphabetical order, I suppose.
Sure. Thank you, Nick, and thank you for the Chartis team for inviting me. So my name's Guy Sheppard. I'm joining you today from Singapore, so good evening. And my financial crime background is about 16 years, having worked in product for various different vendors, having run FinCrime for Swift for Asia Pac for 7 years, I believe, and even a spell with the Met Police in counterterrorism. And what I do now is I lead the commercial and markets teams for a data science and machine learning consultancy that's owned by a Filipino conglomerate, Aboitiz. So I represent ADI. So thank you very much. And as I said, super excited about this panel.
Raina, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Raina Verma. I'm joining you from Dubai today. I have 20 years of experience in the space of fraud, governance, and compliance, and I currently provide consultation on compliance and fraud frameworks. And I'm very excited to be here today, and thanks for having me.
Thank you. And finally, Stephen, do you mind introducing yourself?
Of course. Greetings, everyone. Stephen Shapiro, FBI. I'm the financial crime supervisor in our Brooklyn, Queens office. My team of agents, analysts, and accountants look at a variety of different frauds and criminal activity that we've been discussing this morning, and we'll continue through this panel.
Thank you. So the overriding theme really of this discussion is how can technology help prevent financial crime? And, we've seen an unprecedented amount of criminal activity, whether it's fraud, money laundering, or other predicate crimes. And it's not just the volume and the velocity of activity that's increasing, it's also the level of complexity and sophistication. And much of that is being driven by criminals, just as us, using technology, innovation, advanced technology to support their cause, I suppose. This is a dual question, really. Firstly, how big do you think this problem is? And secondly, can you just shed some light on some of the technologies and approaches that you're seeing from criminals?
Yeah, it's a significant issue. And as you said, the past 20 plus years have seen an unprecedented explosion of technology in business. Criminal activity has tracked that. We've seen an exponential increase in cyber, financial crime, and money laundering risks. Specific ways that criminals are taking advantage of technology: social media allows subjects to dig up personal information, which they can then use to manipulate unsuspecting victims into romance scams, tech support scams, and crypto confidence scams that we heard about in the last conversation. Digital financial transactions, cryptocurrency, and online banking makes it easier for subjects to rapidly move funds between accounts with an air of anonymity and decentralization as they carry out their illegal activities. And AI and machine learning. We're seeing an explosion of that. We heard in the first panel this morning about a Hong Kong company that was taken for multi-million dollars in a business email compromise related to a deepfake deployment. Phishing schemes and malware intrusions as well will increase as a result of this.
Great, thank you.
I want to add something there, Nick. I think this is an era of suspense, and traditional red flags are no longer traditional. I mean, you don't have the regular office 9 to 5. You've got people working on remote areas. So the way we're approaching things are going to change drastically. And I think we need to do a lot of catching up, and speed is going to be of essence, if I may. Because when it's fraud, it depends on what's your mitigation strategy, how is your escalation matrix working within a company. That's so important, because I've worked with large banks in this region, and I've seen that some of the largest places do not have the incident management. And when things go wrong, because they do go wrong, you don't know which stakeholders to mobilize. And that's a very big challenge. And in this changing environment, I think this is going to get more challenging.
Thank you. Guy, in your experience, is there something that perhaps we can learn from, well, first of all, on what are you seeing in terms of some of the trends of criminals using technology? And then I'll follow it up with some of the approaches that we're seeing in terms of mitigating financial crime, because technology isn't just for criminals to use, it's also for, for us as those.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I guess without stating the obvious, like, I'm not shocked. I mean, there's like, this is nothing new, right? I mean, and I think one of the things I love about fraud in a very perverse way is that I think it keeps you on your toes, because fraud by definition is sort of geared around social events. I think it was mentioned in the first panel, you know, like COVID, and my sort of Singaporean sort of countryman was talking around how, you know, COVID was actually the true sort of innovating force and driving force for change in fin crime. And it also brought around some really interesting typologies. With so many people confined working from home, you had a change of attack vector, with people pretending to be, you know, help desk professionals, right? Speaking to people, you know, in their front rooms. And when I was at Swift, one of the biggest sort of focal points for the community was the sort of North Korean-backed APT-38 or Lazarus gang that was enacting wholesale banking frauds. And, you know, I think that very famously led to Rick Leggett, the deputy director of the NSA, sort of saying, look, nation states are robbing banks. And I think what's very interesting is when you look into it, and when we looked at that from a Swift perspective forensically, there was, you know, manuals on the dark web as to how to, you know, successfully complete a Swift 103 payment message. There are examples of code that could be used to disguise those messages and wipe them from the central repository, or indeed simply crash the system to give them time to cash out. And believe it or not, you know, criminals, there's even in Russia, you have help desks for various viruses or things that you may have downloaded. And I think in scams, what's really interesting now through the advent of technology, and, you know, look, I work in an AI consultancy, we have and will have increasingly AI fighting AI, where a very obvious example, and I think what was fascinating about the Hong Kong cases is the sort of chutzpah really of the perpetrators, right? Like I really admire, I think you have to respect your opponents. And I think increasingly we have these at the edge solutions of, for example, you know, sort of like AI deepfakes, trying to outwit AI programs, looking to detect deepfakes, trying to do likeness tests, because increasingly our society is a lot more disconnected and remote and mobile. So for online account openings, and, you know, if I use terminology the audience would understand, for those that are new to bank, you know, increasingly, you know, this is the preferred method for new accounts to be opened. People don't want to mooch into a branch queue and then fill out tons of forms, right, with a junior RM. Like, no one wants that experience. So I think increasingly you're going to have that. And I think if you look at the tone from the regulators, I genuinely see a switch to outcome. I think regulators are becoming much more outcome focused. That's the expectation. And so to be super clear, it's not enough to go, well, I've got, you know, whether it's like some of the pieces of kit from FeedZai or any of the other vendors, I've bought them and I've bought an enterprise license, so job done. It's really looking at, and I think a change in metrics, like what are the type of levels of disruption that you're able to achieve, and how seamlessly are you able to actually deploy the various different fraud controls. And like any compliance officer, like I think where the industry is changing dramatically is the profile of financial crime professionals. I think increasingly, you know, AI, machine learning, We're going to see changes from old rules-based engines, death by typology, that sort of thing, to you're going to see these kind of hybrid patterns, Nick, where you'll have potentially that sacred cow still in place, and then AI and machine learning models either optimizing alerts, so reducing the noise, the false positives that we all know and love, and improving that detection capability with lookalike programs. If you have ground truth data of this is what a mule account looks like, for example, which was something we built, the models can then start to look for behavior patterns and combinations of behaviors that look very similar to a previous true positive. And that adds a really fascinating dimension to our detection capabilities, because we're going beyond very static yes, no, volume, value elements, or very obvious red flags like, Nick, you open your account and 3 days later change all of your contact details, and you have an email address that has no resemblance to your first and last name, right? Like, that's very obvious. But I think the trick is in really detecting those signals of change, which means that account has been compromised either through collusion or hacking or what have you.
Thanks, Guy. That's really, really insightful. Keen to get Stephen's thoughts as someone who is kind of on the ground and maybe closer to seeing some of this in action, certainly the criminal activity from a law enforcement point of view. Kind of what are the tools and techniques that you as law enforcement do and can use now and perhaps in the future?
Yeah, I mean, we're deploying analytic tools and conducting outreach to industry and communities through technology to help us detect some of this criminal activity and reduce victimization. That's everything from technology helping us with intel sharing, going through large volumes of returns and search warrant returns and grand jury material, as well as verifying evidence that may be coming across our desk as well.
Actually, that's a great point on the intel sharing. And actually, I'm just going to bring Raina in here because as someone who has both implemented and advised on some of this technology, what are some of the benefits that data sharing, data and analytics can bring? And I guess ultimately, especially thinking about it from your banking background, what are some of the challenges? And we all know, of course, about legacy architecture, etc. But
Nick, I think that technology integration has been one of the greatest challenges because you have good data sitting in different parts of the institution, but never talking to each other. That's one set of a problem. And then on the other side, we have integration and collaboration with law enforcement, financial institutions, and other banks and in the region. And that's the very important piece because you have gaps and the reward you get for these gaps are the fines and the sanctions. Because someone's not talking to someone within the company and then someone is not talking to someone outside the company. I think this is one of the greatest challenges that institutions even face today. And then we have the reg tech and we need the collaboration and information sharing to happen at a pace that we are able to stop the fraud. And that is something I think that financial institution will have to get better. But I think one of the most important things that they can work on is the predictive analysis, which is taking your historical data and seeing what they can predict as outcomes for the future and how they can be better at doing what they've already done in the past. I think that piece has a lot of moving parts to it within the company. And if we work on that piece, there's a lot of progress that we can make.
Yes, and actually, on that point about data and analytics, one of the things we're seeing, and again, this ties to the first point around the way that criminals are using technology, is some of the traditional signals are no longer relevant. So, for example, the obvious ways of detecting, phishing emails was through, spelling mistakes, etc. That's no longer really as much of an issue. So it's forcing us to rethink really the way that we, identify fraudulent and criminal behavior and the way that we sort of prevent it. So really, this is a question for everyone, but what are some of the ways that you think we need to rethink the way that we are identifying financial crime? And can you give some examples if you have any?
Yeah, I can just pick on something very quickly. Binance, if you see that there were transactions that were passed for so long, and now they became the usual. So somebody would have checked that box saying these are okay to go. Now we really need to rethink when something is happening and it's happening as a process. We need to go back and check that data for correctness. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that organizations make, that they sit on the static model of alerts and don't really look at it in a dynamic way. That's something that I can think at the top of my head. And the other thing is the data itself. One problem we have that we don't share the data enough within the system. So there's a system that doesn't talk to another system within the company. And the other problem that you have is you've got this data flowing within the organization without the classification and right masking. So what happens is you've got employees who probably contract employees or vendors who have access to very sensitive data, and that is probably traded in some black market or elsewhere, and there are other problems. I think these are the two things that I can think at the top of my head.
Yeah, and I agree, Raina, and I think breaking down those barriers, both internal silos as well as between law enforcement and other agencies and amongst industry is incredibly important too. Nick, to your point, the traditional vectors for identifying a phishing email may not be there anymore, but everyone carries at least one computer in their pocket, if not more. So you have all of that digital exhaust, you have all of that other information and data out there. So where one vector may have been cut off, there's several more. And criminals are just like everyone else. They're producing trails and pattern of life from their social media activity, their online purchases, cell phone usage that we can exploit as well.
So I think this is, I guess my take on this is like, of course, like what Steve and Raina is saying is absolutely bang on. And I think I'd kind of echo what I thought was really interesting, a comment from your colleague, actually, Nick, from the first panel around how you're going to have, in line with levels of perhaps regulatory severity, data maturity, all of these different issues sort of combined, you're going to have very much a sort of different, different countries are going to be able, professionals working in different countries and jurisdictions are going to have an uneven playing field. And when we were kind of discussing this, I kind of thought about it, right, in terms of what does this journey look like? And so if I kind of start with Raina, everyone is starting at a point of trying to improve. All banks have got data, like tons of it, in most cases too much. Same with law enforcement. The challenge is not the data, it's the quality of it and it's the accessibility. So what we tend to see is companies start with very large data quality overhaul projects, and then you're going to start to get golden sources. And then with those golden and trusted sources, you're going to overlay some basic analytics, right? Dashboarding and whatnot. And then you're going to start to, then what I kind of see as the next level on this maturity sort of curve is sort of digitization and automation of kind of core processes. And this is nothing, we're not even at neural networks or anything particularly sexy, but the ROI is that you're using chatbots and you're using APIs and you're using RPA to simply automate, streamline, and make existing processes more robust, right? Like that's the business case. And then the key stumbling block for everybody is then the accessibility of this data. And I don't think we've got time to do a quick survey of the audience, but how many people are familiar with this scenario that you want to access production data, you go into a very secure room on a dumb laptop, and it's something out of like a mortuary lab, right? Like super clean surgical room. And it's absolutely insane. We have the technology now to be able to democratize data. And to Raina and Stephen's point, we have to get past these silos, because what we're trying to do is achieve, modeling techniques, whether it's in-house, buy versus build. You're looking at like anomaly detection. It's like my daughter's favorite program on TV, Sesame Street. One of these is not the other. That's what you're looking for. And is it anomalous because for a very valid reason? Perhaps Guy Sheppard and Stephen Shapiro were put in the same customer segment, but wrongly classified? Or is it an anomaly for reasons we don't understand? There's no context for this transaction. There's no context for this value or logical rationale. And that's when we start looking at improving the quality of alerts. And the ROI is enabling your human capital to prioritize from noise, clearly a false positive because blah, 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 to something actually more high value. And we have to. So to answer your question directly, how fin crime needs to change is that we start looking at individuals as individuals. Is this transaction or this behavior pattern strange for Guy Sheppard, not part of a segment, not part of some form of classification? And that's when that's when the magic happens. That's when you have this 360-degree view of a customer, and you can start allowing the technology to do what it was designed to do, which is go, okay, we think Guy Sheppard's a person of interest. Let's identify anyone else that shares some form of relationship with Guy, either through transactions, through similar data, similar personal information, similar address locations. What else can we see about him? But the biggest challenge is in that accessibility and democratizing that data. And it is absolutely possible. I don't want to give out plugs to technology providers, but the big catchphrases are we've got a zero trust environment, and technology will enable you to do that. It then just becomes understanding what data you have and where, and what then is the purpose behind its being accessed, for whatever use case, right? And I think that's really when the game changes.
Great point. And technology allows for that customization where it didn't in the past, where you had one person, trying to handle all the different customer relationships. Impossible. Machine learning now. That's in line of sight.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a great point, Stephen. So I'm keen to understand how. So in the industry, so we speak to a lot of banks and similar institutions, and we sort of know the way that they are using data analytics, etc. But I'm keen to understand those of you kind of fighting financial crime on the ground. Firstly, how do you currently make the most of that, and is there anything more that we as an industry could do? And I'm saying we, meaning banks, tech vendors, etc., could do to kind of help your fight in really going to that follow the crime piece?
Yeah, well, just as it allows financial institutions to better understand and comprehend their customers, it allows criminals to better target and tailor their scams and their prompts to particular victims. So, again, con man confidence scam. So they're trying to create a situation where you trust them and you don't think twice before acting. So that's where these deepfakes and these situations come in. A particular concern to me is not just, the fact that you only need a 3-second audio clip for a chatbot to mimic your voice easily. Of concern to me is that now this calls all evidence into question of this nature. It used to be if I had a confession, if I had audio recording or video of a criminal engaged in activity or admitting to something, that was a good day for me. Now, as all of these white collar cases became cyber cases 20 years ago or more, now all of these cases are becoming AI cases. For us to have a successful prosecution, the technology's created a situation where we're going to have to prove the negative. We're going to have to prove that this video, that this evidence is legitimate, it is genuine, and not a deep fake and not AI generated. So coming up with that fingerprint or verification process for this kind of content is going to be critical.
Great point. And just Sorry, go for it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I want to add to what Steve is saying, that seeing is no longer believing. because first you'll have to justify, is it legit? Is it a legit record to be reliable and use it as evidence? So that's a game changer, Nick. That's going to be a game changer. And one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have is that the technology is moving very fast for the front-facing units of an institution, for banks and financial institutions, but that's not the case in the middle and the back office. So the process is not being updated at the same speed as the technology is. And that is where the fraud happens, because fraud is only looking for gaps. And this is what gives criminals the gap that they want to do the fraud. Because most of the time when we've done investigations, to Guy's point, going back to the very basic, we've always seen that anything that's been urgent and it requires to be done today is something that we've done something wrong and something's happened. You skip the process, you find a gap in the process, and you give fraud the space to happen.
So on that point of the sort of misalignment between front and back office, I think we're seeing misalignment really across many different vectors, including different crime typologies. But of course, we are seeing some of the convergence of that through platformization as one example, but many different examples. And also, as one of the big shifts that we are seeing, and kind of we touched on this earlier, is there's a cultural shift towards collaboration and working together. And this panel is a perfect example. We've got 3 people from different backgrounds and different kind of looking at things from different approaches, largely agreeing on most things. So I really want to touch on that collaborative piece. What are we doing well, and what can we be doing better for as a kind of industry?
Could I take a punt at this? So I think I'd go with this, and sorry to be so cheesy, but with a kind of stop, start, continue. And maybe stop, start, continue, go faster. So I think the growth of like public-private partnerships, to me, is like an absolute sort of lighthouse in the industry. And I think that's something that we need to see more of. And I think to sympathize for law enforcement colleagues, there has to be a better and a safer way for financial crime professionals in a financial services institution to be able to communicate more openly without using, your former colleague that you worked together at Citi, who's now over at Bank of XYZ, to go, have you come across Guy Sheppard? Because we think he's a bit dodgy, X, Y, and Z. And so you've got your sort of Gimlets and Fimlets and all this sort of stuff that are actually starting to show, I like genuinely posting results, right? Like I sort of looked it up. So Fimlet in Hong Kong, that, they quote 250 plus arrests, different numbers of partners, prosecutions, and number of assets seized. And I think there's also another important element with public-private partnerships where they can also help prioritize and focus, FSIs on what really matters. So, for example, the Fintel Alliance in Australia has raised the profile of child exploitation and human trafficking off the back of insert name of very well-known bank and that case that went everywhere. So I think that's very important. And I think a lot of banks should also start their own kind of sandbox environment. I don't see why this should be the preserve of a regulatory organization or some sort of quango. You have to be able to have a way to interact with technologists to be able to access your data. I think those things are sort of critically important. And I think what we need to stop doing is just talking about it. Like, I think there's so many options out there, and there needs to be, and what I think is really important and a continuation is chief data officers now, by comparison to what they used to be, play, I think, a much more strategic role. And can become real partners to the organization in how, they can reshape the way that the bank operates, the way that the bank thinks about data and that culture, and that every single compliance or fraud professional has only got positive things to gain from that.
Completely agree. To that point, I mean, we would consider the best victim to be no victim at all. So if there is a business solution that prevents that victimization occurring, that allows us to focus on the serious incidents where criminals are circumventing those safeguards and working around them, so we can dedicate our resources to the more sophisticated, involved organizations, criminal organizations.
And I'd just like to quickly add there that, building bridges with law enforcement is very rewarding, but it's also challenging, Steve, because when you're working with law enforcement on a case and you've got these reports and you've got the system data, but you don't have skilled employees, analysts who are skilled in fraud and compliance, verifying it, it's very hard for you to pass on that evidence to the law enforcement. Yeah. So I think institutions needs to work on increasing the staff in these areas and having expertise, in-house expertise, to be able to deal with law enforcement, because that will be one of the best strategies that an organization can have in these times.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why we do panels like this is to spread that knowledge and share how we can work together best.
Fantastic. I'm conscious that we are almost on time. Unfortunately, this has flown by. So much to take in there. And I think the last point around collaboration, and we are all in this together, as we say. So let's work closer together. Let's communicate more and so on. So thank you, Raina, Guy, and Stephen. This has been immensely useful for me, and it was a pleasure to have you all on this panel. So thank you so much.